When I was 16, my family's farm in Kansas was my whole world. The endless cornfields stretched far beyond the horizon, their tall, whispering stalks both comforting and eerie. During the day, the fields were a golden refuge, but at night, they became a shadowy labyrinth. Little did I know, they were hiding something far worse than my imagination could ever conjure. It started on a humid summer evening. I was brushing my teeth when I heard it, a faint, high-pitched scream coming from the direction of the cornfield. My hand froze mid-swipe, and I strained to listen. It wasn't the sound of a coyote or a fox. This was different. It sounded human. I called for my dad, but he dismissed it, saying it was probably just animals. He was always practical like that, and I wanted to believe him. But the sound lingered in my mind as I crawled into bed. That night, I dreamt of shadowy figures moving through the corn, their voices whispering my name. The next evening, the screams returned, louder and more desperate. This time, my mom heard it too. She exchanged a worried glance with my dad, and he reluctantly grabbed his shotgun and a flashlight.
"Stay inside,"
he ordered as he stepped into the night. I pressed my face to the window, watching the beam of his flashlight bob through the field. The screams stopped as soon as he entered the rows of corn. Minutes ticked by, and an unsettling silence blanketed the farm. Then, suddenly, the flashlight went out.
"Dad,"
I shouted, panic surging through me. He burst out of the field moments later, his face pale and drenched in sweat.
"Get inside. Lock the doors,"
he barked, his voice trembling. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat by the window with his shotgun, staring out at the field. When I asked what he'd seen, he just shook his head and muttered,
"You don't want to know."
The next morning, we found several patches of corn flattened, as if something large had moved through the field. There were no footprints, no tracks, just strange, almost circular impressions in the dirt. Dad called the sheriff, but after a cursory inspection, they shrugged it off as a prank or weather-related. Days passed without incident, but the tension in our home was palpable. Dad refused to let me go near the field, even during the day. He also started locking the doors and windows at dusk, something he'd never done before. Then one night, the screams came back. This time, they were closer, so close that it felt like whoever or whatever was making them was right outside the house. My mom clutched her rosary, whispering prayers under her breath.
"We can't just sit here,"
I yelled, my voice shaking. But before anyone could respond, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed on our porch. Dad aimed his shotgun at the front door, his hands trembling. The door handle jiggled violently, and then came 3 slow, deliberate knocks.
"Who's there?"
Dad called, but there was no answer. The knocks came again, louder this time, followed by a guttural, inhuman growl that sent chills down my spine. Dad fired a warning shot through the door, and whatever was out there let out a blood-curdling scream before retreating into the night. We didn't sleep at all that night. By morning, Dad decided we were going to stay with my aunt in town until he could figure out what was going on. As we packed, I couldn't resist looking out the window one last time. That's when I saw it. Standing at the edge of the cornfield was a figure. It was tall, impossibly so, with long, spindly arms that hung at its sides. Its face, or what I assumed was its face, was obscured by shadow, but I could feel its eyes boring into me.
"Dad,"
I whispered, pointing toward the window. He looked, but by the time he did, the figure was gone. We left that afternoon and never came back. Dad sold the farm within a month, though he never told the buyer about what had happened. Years later, I still have nightmares about the screams and that shadowy figure. Sometimes I can still hear it calling to me in the dead of night, a faint, high-pitched wail carried on the wind. Whatever it was, it's out there, hiding in the corn, waiting for someone foolish enough to step inside. Growing up, my grandparents owned a small farm in the middle of nowhere. Every summer, I'd spend a few weeks there, helping out with chores and enjoying the solitude of country life. But there was one part of the farm I always avoided: the scarecrow in the east field. It wasn't like other scarecrows I'd seen. It stood taller, its tattered clothes flapping in the wind like they had a life of their own. Its head was a burlap sack, stitched crudely with black thread to resemble a face. But it wasn't the look of it that unnerved me. It was the way it felt like it was watching me.
Why don't you just get rid of it?
I asked Grandpa one evening after dinner. He glanced out the window toward the east field, his expression darkening.
It's been here longer than I have,
he said.
We leave it be.
His tone made it clear the conversation was over. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as the summer breeze rattled the windows. I couldn't shake the feeling of those stitched eyes staring at me, even from half a mile away. The next day, curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight and ventured into the east field just before dusk. The rows of corn were dense and silent, their stalks swaying gently as I approached the scarecrow. An unnatural stillness settled over the field. Up close, it was even worse. The burlap face looked almost alive. The black stitches seemed tighter, pulling the fabric into an unnatural grimace. Its arms were outstretched, tied to a wooden frame, but the way they hung made it look like it was ready to pounce. I don't know what possessed me to touch it, but I reached out and brushed my hand against the fabric. It was damp. Though the weather had been dry for days, startled, I stumbled back, and that's when I noticed something chilling. The corn around the scarecrow wasn't growing. The ground was bare, as though the earth itself refused to nurture life near it. I ran back to the house, my heart pounding. I didn't tell Grandpa what I'd done. That night, I was woken by a tapping sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it was too deliberate. Tap, tap, like fingernails on glass. I sat up, my stomach knotting. The sound was coming from the window. Swallowing my fear, I crept toward it and pulled back the curtain. My breath caught in my throat. Standing just outside, illuminated by the moonlight, was the scarecrow. It wasn't tied to its frame anymore. The stitched eyes seemed to glow faintly, and its head tilted to the side, as if studying me. I backed away, tripping over a chair and crashing to the floor. When I scrambled back to the window, it was gone. I didn't sleep after that. I sat in the corner of my room, clutching a flashlight and waiting for morning. When the first rays of sunlight streamed through the window, I finally dared to step outside. The scarecrow was back in the field, tied to its frame as though it had never moved. I told Grandpa what had happened, expecting him to laugh it off or scold me for making up stories. Instead, his face went pale.
You shouldn't have gone near it,
he said, his voice barely above a whisper.
That thing isn't just a scarecrow.
He wouldn't say more, but he made me swear never to approach it again. For the rest of the summer, I avoided the east field, but no matter where I went on the farm, I could feel its presence. Sometimes, I'd catch a glimpse of it out of the corner of my eye, and I could swear it had moved. On my last night there, I woke up to the sound of the front door creaking open. I rushed downstairs to find Grandpa standing on the porch, staring out at the field.
It's calling,
he muttered. I grabbed his arm, trying to pull him back inside, but he shook me off and started walking toward the scarecrow.
Grandpa, no,
I screamed, but he didn't stop. As he neared the scarecrow, it began to twitch. Its head turned slowly toward him, and the stitched mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. I froze, paralyzed by fear, as the scarecrow's arms broke free from the wooden frame. It lunged at Grandpa, wrapping its long, straw-filled limbs around him. His screams echoed through the night, then abruptly stopped. When I dared to look again, the scarecrow was back on its frame, motionless, Grandpa was gone. I never returned to the farm after that. It was sold off to a distant relative, and I've avoided any mention of it ever since. But sometimes, late at night, I dream of the scarecrow's glowing eyes and its stitched grin, and I know it's still out there, waiting. I never believed in ghost stories. Growing up, my dad used to tease me about my city skepticism. Every time I visited my grandparents' farm, to me, the eerie tales about their land were just that, stories. But one summer night, the old barn at the edge of the property changed everything. The barn had been abandoned for years. Its roof sagged, the wooden beams were weathered and splintered, and the doors creaked with every gust of wind. Grandpa said it hadn't been used since before I was born. Yet, every so often, someone would mention the lights.
Just kids messing around.
Dad said.
Animals.
Grandpa added with a shrug. But one night, curiosity got the better of me. I'd spent the day helping Grandpa repair a fence. By the time we finished, the sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in deep purples and oranges. I stood by the kitchen window, watching as the shadows swallowed the barn. That's when I saw it, a flicker of light in the upper window of the barn. It wasn't fire, it was too white, too steady. It reminded me of an old lantern, swinging slightly as if someone were carrying it.
Grandpa.
I called, but he was already snoring in his armchair. I stood, frownsome, debating whether to investigate. Then the light moved. It wasn't just swaying. It was walking up and down the loft of the barn, as though someone was pacing. Before I could stop myself, I grabbed the flashlight and headed outside. The summer air was thick and warm, but the closer I got to the barn, the colder it felt. The tall grass whispered against my legs, and the cicadas seemed to grow quieter with every step. The barn door stood slightly ajar.
Hello.
I called, shining my flashlight into the dark interior. My voice sounded small, swallowed by the cavernous space. I stepped inside, my boots crunching on the dirt floor. The smell of mildew and decay hit me like a wall. But there was something else too, an acrid, metallic scent that made my stomach turn. I swept the flashlight across the room. The stalls were empty, filled with cobwebs and broken tools. The ladder leading up to the loft was still intact, though it looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. That's when I saw it again. The light. It was directly above me now, swaying back and forth. I craned my neck, trying to see the source, but there was nothing. Just the faint glow of the light moving across the wooden planks of the loft.
Who's up there?
I demanded, my voice trembling. The light stopped. For a long moment, everything was silent. Then I heard it, the sound of footsteps crossing the loft. They were slow, deliberate, and impossibly heavy, like boots made of stone. My heart raced as I backed toward the door. But before I could leave, the light suddenly flared, illuminating the loft. And I saw it. A figure stood in the center of the loft, hunched and wrong. Its limbs were too long, its posture unnatural, and its face, God. Its face was a blur of shadow and light, as if it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. It tilted its head toward me, and though it had no eyes, I felt its gaze pierce through me. I turned and ran, tripping over the threshold of the barn door. The flashlight slipped from my hand, but I didn't stop. I sprinted back to the house, my breath coming in ragged gasps. When I finally reached the porch, I dared to look back. The barn was dark again, as if nothing had happened. I didn't sleep that night. The image of the figure haunted me, burned into my mind like an after-image of staring into the sun. The next morning, I told Grandpa what I'd seen. I expected him to laugh or dismiss me, but his face grew grim.
You saw it.
He said quietly. He explained that the barn had been abandoned after a tragic fire years ago. A hired hand, a drifter no one knew much about, had been trapped inside. When they found his body, They said he looked wrong, as though the fire had twisted him in ways no one could explain.
The lights started after that.
Grandpa said,
Always at night. Always in the loft.
I begged him to tear the barn down, but he shook his head.
Some things are best left alone.
I left the farm that summer and never went back. But sometimes, late at night, I dream of that barn. I see the light swaying in the loft, and I hear those heavy footsteps. And every time I wake up with the same thought. It wasn't trying to scare me, it was warning me.